Ayukui, Kaitlin Reed. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Native American Studies, and I am a member of the Yurok tribe, just north of Wiyok territory, where we all are here. I'll start with some gratitude. Thanks, Jeff, for the kind introduction. Thank you, SBF, for doing all the background work to make the event happen. The catering's really good, so thank you. Thank you to all my colleagues for your really inspirational talks. And I'll thank my partner Michael for doing dishes and cooking dinner on all the nights where I complained that I should probably be writing right now, and then probably played video games instead. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, Settler Cannabis. As Jeff mentioned, it was published by the University of Washington Press in June of 2023. It's been over a year now, and I'm like supposed to get back on the horse and do another one, but I've been tired, so I'll just keep talking about this book. I am going to keep my remarks to 10 minutes, which I think might be more challenging than writing a book. So here we go. In the first half of the text, the goal here is to provide historical context in California because the Green Rush, and by Green Rush I'm referencing a surge in cannabis cultivation in northwestern California, an area often dubbed as the Emerald Triangle, because there are, right, our baseline isn't neutral at that point, right? We're starting with impaired landscapes over a various cycle of natural resource rushes. And so the first chapter focuses on gold and the state-sponsored genocide that occurs during that time period, the refusal of the US Senate to ratify the 18 treaties in California. The second chapter then turns to the timber rush and the way that that facilitates widespread fire suppression across California, which then impairs Native people's abilities to take care of their landscapes and feed themselves. Chapter 3 looks at the fish rush, the commercialization of fishing industries in California, kind of culminating in Chapter 3 in the 2002 fish kill along with Klamath River, which is the largest documented fish kill in American history. And then the first half of the book then concludes with a critical engagement of the Back to the Land movement, which I refer to as back to whose land. And I argue that it is simply another pattern of settler colonial land dispossession, even though it is very kind of romanticized here in Humboldt County and kind of looked at with a heavy dose of nostalgia. And then the second half of the book kind of hones in on some of the impacts of cannabis cultivation, specifically trespass cannabis cultivation. And I organized this somewhat arbitrarily in land dispossession, toxics, and water. I like to start with a couple caveats. And so I say a lot of stuff about cannabis cultivation in the book, but I like to start by saying cannabis is a plant, and that means it's a relative, and that means we have to treat it with respect. And like the problems I identify in the book aren't particular to cannabis, rather I see them as critiques of settler colonial relationships to land and patterns of natural resource extraction. I never actually really set out to write a book about weed. That just happened to be the thing that was impacting my ancestral territory when I began graduate school, and I said, well, nobody's really talking about Indigenous people's perspectives and the fact that our river systems are like running dry now. And so I felt compelled to provide an Indigenous critique, right, of the industry. The other caveat I like to provide, I really don't care if you smoke weed. You don't need to disclose that to me after the talk. To me, cannabis is almonds. Has anyone had almond milk maybe? Yeah, lots of us. Whether we're lactose intolerant, whether we're trying to consume less dairy, whatever the reason. We produce like a ton of almonds in the Central Valley of California. It takes a ton of water, and we export the vast majority of it outside of the US, right? And a small number of corporations profit immensely. But there's not really this like moral debate of like, well, should we even be eating almonds? Should we even be producing almonds? Like, we're there already. And so for me, kind of conversations about whether or not we should be consuming cannabis actually detract from the argument that I want to make, that this is an agricultural crop that has for a long time had unchecked environmental catastrophes, right, that have followed it. And so when I started graduate school, I saw a lot of references to this green rush. Are people familiar with this kind of ideology or this language, right? Like this was just from a Google image search. We see a miner from the gold rush era with a pot leaf overlaid over top of his panning for gold. And I think like the attitude at this time was like really excited, like, hey everybody, this gold rush was a great thing. We're gonna get to do it all over again via the cannabis industry. But what many students in California are never taught is that the gold rush was actually an apocalypse for California Indian peoples. And the state, one of the very first pieces of legislation that the state of California comes together to create is a law to facilitate the slavery of Indigenous kids. And that same year, they then facilitate legislation to create militias that are going out to hunt Native peoples, right? And so when we kind of memorialize and celebrate the gold rush, as an Indigenous scholar, I'm sitting in the back of the room saying like, I don't think that means what you think it does, right? And so for me, this green rush ideology was very reminiscent, right, of previous patterns of resource rushing that have had devastating consequences for California Indian people. And so before we get into some photographs of some trespass cultivation sites in Yurok ancestral territory, I wanted to transition with this wonderful quote from Native American Studies professor, Dr. Cutcha Risling-Baldy. She writes, well, she told me, the rush mentality is what founded Humboldt County. People act like that was so long ago, and we've definitely moved on, that we're this very green, friendly place, we're liberal, we're leftist. This is how people think of Humboldt County. But what founded us is this gold rush, and we have been rushing ever since. So after the gold rush didn't make us enough money, well, let's rush any kind of minerals that we can get. And then after that, well, that didn't make us enough. Let's rush timber. And I think we've been rushing since 1849. So I'll start with water. On the left is an example of a makeshift watering infrastructure. So what they did is they dug a big hole in the ground. They lined it with a tarp. They stuck a pipe in the river and filled it up. So a lot of trespass cultivators don't have like a PhD in agronomy and might not be familiar with best agricultural practices. What we've found at some of these sites is that growers will they'll get like a 40-gallon drum, right, of a chemical that you're supposed to like pour into a little bottle and dilute. So it's like 10% solution, like 90% water. They don't know that, and they dump the drum into the pond. Right? So we see a lot of contamination because eventually that's going to either seep into the soil or go like back into the pipe to get into the tributary and eventually the main stem of the river. On the left, you're looking at polyethylene tubing that is used as irrigation at a lot of trespass sites within Yurok ancestral territory. I actually opened the book with a story about these tubes because when I was an intern for the Yurok tribe, one of my jobs was to rip up polyethylene tubes on the side of hillsides, like in July in the sun, and it was hot. And I was like complaining, and I like had made like a giant pile already, and I look over, and there's like another mountainside just like covered in them, and I'm like, this is never ending. What I say about these pipes, so for me, I really wanted to situate trespass cannabis cultivation within a broader conversation of Indigenous environmental justice. And while I was out there, I thought back to a friend of mine, Dr. Jessa Ray Growing Thunder. We went to graduate school together at UC Davis. And we were in graduate school in 2016 when the Dakota Access Pipeline was being constructed. And water protectors were gathering in Cannonball, North Dakota, and they were being sprayed with water cannons and tear gas, and attack dogs were being released on them. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar, the Oceti-Sakowin Nation actually has a prophecy. It's called the Zuzeka Sapa prophecy, or the Black Snake. They have and I'm not as good of a storyteller as Dr. Growing Thunder, but she told me that the story kind of goes, one day there'd be a big black snake that cuts across the landscape, and it would destroy everything in its path. And it would be up to the people to rise up and defeat it. Pretty transparently, the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? But when she told me that story, I thought about polyethylene tubing. And we don't have like one giant black snake that you can see from space. We have like millions of black snakes like all up and down hillsides that are invisible, right, if you don't know where to look. And so I opened the book with that story to kind of situate what's happening here in Northwestern California within a broader conversation of Indigenous environmental justice. Here's an example of some clear cutting, right? As you know, Humboldt County is incredibly forested. Not a really smart place to do like large-scale industrial agriculture. Here's a comparison photo. So for reference, Operation Yurok, which is one of the many things I can't explain because I have 10 minutes, but the book is available for $29.99 at Northtown. Here is a comparison photo. The photo above is taken in 2012. 2 years later, you can see the extent of clear cutting, which has a variety of impacts for a lot of our more than human relatives, right, in this region. A lot of toxics and contaminants are left behind at sites. One of the kind of most frequently found contaminants is something called rodenticide. This is like an over-the-counter rat poison. It's a vitamin K inhibitor, so essentially the critter will like bleed out. They don't like die immediately. They're more susceptible to predation, right? And so we are then going to see that contaminant kind of make its way, right, through other species. One of the scholars that was very helpful to me when writing the toxics chapter was Dr. Murad Gabriel, who has been doing work at trespass sites near Hoopa as well as the Sierra Nevadas. He told me, so this was a photograph that he took at one of these trespass sites, that hot dog is stuffed with carbamates. I don't have my little note card to tell me what that will do to your body, but likely should not be ingested. And now they make these types of contaminants like in like bacon flavor, and they are widely available and found left behind at sites. The other thing I will quickly note is when you go to an abandoned trespass cultivation site, they do not have a filing cabinet with all the contaminants neatly organized and labeled. Often we're talking about like milk jugs or Nestle water bottles filled with something like bright blue or bright pink, and you're like wading through it and trying to identify, right, what those contaminants even are. Here's some garbage. Lots of garbage is left behind at these sites. Household garbage, petroleum products, batteries, refrigerators, ovens. One site we found like 1,200 bicycles. I don't know why. But in terms of the expenses of addressing cleanup for a lot of these trespass sites, is really, really challenging. And for contaminants, right, we are only able to hit like a small fraction of abandoned trespass cultivation sites. And eventually, right, those contaminants, the plastics that they are in are going to degrade, and whatever is in them is gonna like seep into the soil, seep into the water. And so I want to end with two things. The first is a really gross story, so I hope you've eaten already. Oftentimes, when you are establishing a trespass cultivation site, you're not there for the long haul. You're not thinking about worker infrastructure, right, and creating like a sanitary workplace. So they're not constructing latrines, they're not constructing outhouses. Some of you know where this story is going. One of the trespass cultivation sites we had found, folks had been like openly defecating in the tributaries of the Klamath River, and a lot of tribal community members in 2015 were getting E. coli, and we didn't know why. And we did our due diligence. We went to all the RV sites, even though they were downriver, and that didn't make sense. And we deduced that the thing that was making tribal members sick, right, were these trespass grows and the sewage contamination that was occurring at these sites. And the grossest site that thankfully I didn't have to go to, we found 100 5-gallon buckets that were filled and capped with human sewage. And so I'm like, why does it fall to tribes to like clean up after settler shit? Literally. And so I will close. There's a Sierra Fund report that came out in 2008. They estimate that there are 50,000 abandoned gold mines left over from the gold rush era that still haven't been cleaned up. 87% of them present human or environmental health impacts today, right? And so my question that I like pose in the book is like, if California hasn't like figured out how to clean up after the gold rush, like what makes it think it is equipped, right, to deal with the ramifications of the green rush? So I will end there. Thank you so much for coming, everybody.